Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good that you've been able to join us today for our first in the Agricultural Forum seminar series for the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering in 2021. It's my pleasure, first of all, to acknowledge to acknowledge the country on whose lands we meet, and to also pay respect to the elders, past, present, and future. I know each of us is actually in a very different part of Australia, and so each of us needs to think about the local people in our region. Now, it's my job, I'm Joanne Daly, and I'm the Deputy Chair of the Agricultural Forum in ATSE, and it's my job to give you some housekeeping arrangements. You will see on the bottom part of your screen a set of buttons, and one of those is the Q&A button. At the end of the session today, we will have a question and answer session, and we will draw those questions from what you put in the Q&A session. You won't be able to be heard, so you won't be able to come on screen or talk to us, but you can actually put a question in through the Q&A. You can also use the chat function if you want to share ideas and views with other members of the other people who are participating in this panel. And at present, we've got 73 people online, so there's many other people you may wish to share views with, but the questions and answers, the questions you should put on the Q&A function. In a moment, I'll introduce Snow Barlow, who will then introduce our speaker, Professor Tim Reeves. Tim will speak to about 12:30, and then we'll have an open session of questions and answers. And the seminar will finish at 1 o'clock. And I know most of you have got other things to do, and so we will finish on time. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Snow Barlow, who has been professor at Melbourne University. He's an emeritus professor. Snow also, in addition to being academically very involved in education and research in the agricultural sciences, is also a wine grower. And we see him actually in his home in the wine growing area of Victoria. So Snow, it's my pleasure to hand over to you as chair of the Agricultural and Food Forum in ATSE to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. The Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering is one of Australia's 5 learned academies, and it has almost 900 elected fellows. The Agricultural and Food Forum is one of the 9 policy forums that within what we call ATSE. The idea of these webinars is that to discuss important both technological and innovative and policy questions that are confronting Australia's agricultural and food supply systems, and also global issues that emerge. If any of you, this will be a monthly series, and if any of you, as we go through today, would have ideas of what you think are critical topics that would benefit from a discussion in a forum such as this, please enter them in the chat room, which we are able to recover those later. Today is almost a year since we were digesting those first reports of a new virus emanating out of China that may have significant global ramifications. 1 year on, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We've seen in this past year the folly of national leaders thumbing their noses at the science of infection in favour of perceived economic advantage. We've also seen that many of the systems that underpin our society, the health, education, and of course food, have been challenged by the challenges of COVID. So today we are running this first seminar to address this problem which concerns us and concerns the globe on what is the impact of COVID now and into the future on global food security and nutrition. In doing that, we're very fortunate to have Professor Tim Reeves here today. Tim is to address this issue, and Tim is one of Australia's most distinguished agricultural scientists, having made significant contributions in the areas of no-till agriculture and many other areas, both nationally and internationally. So today, it is my pleasure to welcome Tim Reeves to address you. And Tim, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Snow. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see that. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thanks very much, Joe and Snow. In talking about this today, I want to talk about some of the issues of the COVID-19 pandemic and our agri-food systems, some of the interactions of it with other challenges to those systems, some of the findings to date, to air some of the potential ways forward, and certainly raise some questions that academies, universities, and others that we all need to think about in terms of how we move forward. Last year, I was asked by one of the major international development prizes to do a study on the impacts of COVID-19 on food security. And that's certainly been one of the sources of my information, as well as a lot of other publications which I've included in the bibliography. When we're talking about the pandemic, it's really important to put it in context. And we already knew that our agri-food systems are facing some major challenges. And Sir John Beddington in 2009 said, by 2030, we'll be having the perfect storm. We'll need more people requiring more food, and we'd add to that now more nutritious food. And I remind you that global population is still growing at about 160 people per minute, all of whom who need to be fed. But for that extra food, there's going to be less land, less water to produce it with. We're going to have to use less energy-rich inputs. We need to have less greenhouse gas emissions from our agri-food sector, and all of this happening under the scenario of climate change. So these challenges were there already, and we're trying to develop them, and then along came the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really important that as we think about this, we think about it in that context of interactions. Now, the pandemic itself, it is truly momentous. Over 2 million lives have been lost, and the tragedy mounts with every minute. It's disrupted the livelihoods of billions of people, including of many of the 500 million smallholder farmers who produce around 50% of the food consumed globally. The World Bank has said the global economy is going to shrink by at least 5%. And the World Food Programme has said this is not only a global health pandemic, but also a global humanitarian catastrophe. And as we look at our agri-food systems, it's in that context that we need to be thinking of them. And so all of the things around the pandemic, the health impacts, lockdowns, travel restrictions, closed businesses, closed schools, unemployment, have all disrupted our agri-food systems in one way or the other. And in some ways that we didn't think about, we didn't foreshadow. Closing schools. In many countries of the world, school meals are a crucial part of food and nutritional security for the children, but then indirectly for the families as well. Schools closed, there were no school meals. An immediate impact on agri-food systems that one wouldn't necessarily think about immediately. Again, in terms of context, there's progress reports always on the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things that we need to take into account when considering the pandemic are that our agri-food systems and related development goals were already struggling to deliver globally what they need to do. And so in this chart here, there's a whole series of charts of this nature covering all of the goals, and they use the traffic light system, the red, the amber, and the green. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, it's really important to understand that when you look across the goals, the least progress had been made in SDG 2, ending hunger, agri-food, SDG 12, sustainable consumption of resources, SDG 13, climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and SDG 15 around protecting and restoring ecosystems. All of them integrally involved in our agri-food systems. And so this is the context that we already have these challenges and not the rate of progress that we need to be overcoming them when the pandemic struck. So let's look at some of the reports of impacts that have already been made. And in this paper here, which came out in 2020, looked at global food security in the context of COVID-19. And what the author and colleagues found was that, as I briefly mentioned before, that the pandemic is affecting all aspects around food security, affecting production, affecting depleting food stocks, affecting food processing plants through labor and many other issues, obviously impacting on health systems, loss of employment, reduced incomes, increased food prices, impacts on transportation and logistics with lockdowns and trade restrictions as countries have looked to protect themselves first. And so it is not a simple interaction that we're looking at when we're talking about the pandemic and global food and nutritional security. We're looking at it in this context, and therefore when we're thinking about solutions, it has to be systems thinking and not compartmentalized thinking. The disruptions have been right through the value chain, from the provision of inputs, labor, production, transport, marketing, retailing, and as I've mentioned before, these are both direct and indirect effects. Early on in the proceedings, Professor Siddiq from the University of Western Australia said this: as well as emergency support measures for the healthcare system, emergency support measures for food access should also be addressed. COVID-19 does not present an immediate threat to our global food supply, as we have produced enough in previous seasons to have an adequate and stable global supply. However, the ramifications of the pandemic for food access and affordability will disproportionately affect the poor, hungry, and malnourished people of the world. And this was a very foresightful comment relatively early in the piece, in April 2020, from Professor Siddiq. As I said, there are assessments being made of impacts, and this is some work done looking at the impacts of the pandemic on Pacific Island countries and published in 2020. Professor Underhill from the University of the Sunshine Coast led this study where they interviewed nearly 1,300 Pacific Islander smallholder farmers, market vendors and consumers in Tonga, Fiji and Samoa. And what they found was that for most farmers, COVID-19 restrictions had adversely impacted on their production and sales. Farmers reported problems with reduced access, sourcing inputs, increased higher farm labour costs and less labour available. Post-harvest losses increased. Vendors had problems with sourcing products, reduced demand and reduced incomes. Consumers found it more difficult to buy fresh fruit and vegetables with less and fewer varieties. And they noted reduced consumption of fruit and vegetables, particularly for women. Now, this is interesting in many ways, but it's interesting because the incidence of COVID-19 infection in most of the Pacific Island countries is very low. It's very low. But a lot of these disruptions were caused by the restrictions on travel, on global travel, and the impacts on the tourism industry important to many of these countries. And that has had these ramifications on agri-food. So very little infections there, but still significant effects on agri-food systems. Now, in contrast, a much larger country, Bangladesh, where there are pretty high rates of infection of COVID. And this is personal communication from a dear friend of mine who lives in Bangladesh. And I'm putting it here in full so we can all share in what he's saying. Production in subsectors of agriculture has been affected by prolonged lockdown due to corona crisis. Highly restricted movement of transport and vehicles and closure of marketplaces caused unprecedented supply chain disruptions of goods and services. Thousands of smallholder poultry, dairy and aquaculture farmers, as well as vegetable and fruits farmers of Bangladesh and India, failed to sell their produce or could somehow dispose of at throwaway prices. This resulted in huge loss of their working capital and employment of workers. Harvesting of rice crop has been challenged by a shortage of labour caused by the travel embargo. This will have negative impact on next cycle production because of inadequate supplies of inputs, feeds, disease control measures, and finance. And he finished off by saying this, again, one of the things that you don't readily think about 20 million, including garment workers, mostly women, returned to rural areas and put pressure on already tenuous food supply situations. Decline in food consumption is evident, and the income erosion of low-income people will cause further fall in food demand in low-income countries. I've shared it with you in full because I think it's important that we understand that, you know, whatever we're thinking here in Australia, we've got to understand that what's happening in the world, and we're part of the world. And as they've been saying with the vaccination, but it applies to agri-food as well, we cannot be safe until everyone in the world is safe, and we need to take that into account. Again, looking at assessment of impacts to date, ACR, as usual, has been fast off the mark and has been undertaking an assessment initiative to understand and better respond to COVID-19. And if you go to their website, you'll find some very good information there. This came from one of their studies, and they stated a suite of common pre-existing vulnerabilities currently undermining food security was identified across the 5 assessments. They include dependence on food imports, exposure to climate change and extreme weather events, patchy biosecurity, animal health and plant health services, fragmented value chains, and food system governance. And so it's in this scenario that we're looking at the interactions and exacerbating impacts that the pandemic can and is bringing. Switching now to Australia and New Zealand, again, Professor Sadiq and Professor Graham Robertson, both very good colleagues, actually presented a lecture on food security in Western Australia just before Christmas in December. And what they said is that Western Australia is food secure, but relies on a large proportion of its desired food being imported across long distances, while climate change is a medium to long-term threat to the state's agriculture production. And that statement could apply to the whole of Australia, or the most of Australia. But it's the headline that I want to draw your attention to, where they warn about food security complacency. And we certainly cannot be complacent about our agri-food systems anyway, with existing challenges, and certainly not under the pandemic and in the future when we've got to look at similar occurrences that may well occur and highly likely will occur. In a paper from this year, looking at the Australia-New Zealand system, this looked at the immediate impacts of COVID-19 control measures on the agri-food systems of Australia and New Zealand. And these are some of the things that that a very good team of authors found in the two countries. And this was the word frequency of survey responses to questions about the main problems encountered. And I don't need to draw your attention because it's obvious, but that one right in the middle, changes. And it's changes that we have to think about. Are they going to be major changes? Are they tweaking? But we need to be changing the way we're thinking about our agri-food systems. And really, in my mind, one of the main things that the pandemic has done is just underline frailties in our systems in many aspects of our life, not just agri-food, and just brought to the fore about the urgency to actually do more about addressing them. In that paper by Snow and colleagues, they said that we suggest that the resilience in the Australia and New Zealand agri-food systems emerged from a combination of the industries having relatively high technology, being well connected and networked, having some experience of prior shocks, being lowly subsidised by their governments, so those with low financial resistance had likely already exited the industry, and being well supported primarily logistically by their governments. But I have bolded that third dot point myself, and having some experience of prior shocks. And that's really one of the points about today. What are we learning? What will we learn from the shock that we are experiencing right at the moment of the COVID-19 pandemic? And how will we use that to change our approaches, our thinkings, and then our agri-food systems, both nationally and internationally, as we go forward? So thinking about possible ways forward, and thinking about production systems, about supply chains, about the workforce, and thinking, as I said before, we're talking about evolution. Yes, we'll tweak this, we'll tweak that, and we'll all get vaccinated and everything will go back to normal, which I don't believe it will. Or are we talking about revolution? Are we really talking about doing something much more dramatic, much more transformational rather than incremental? Those questions are still unanswered, and why the Academy is running this forum and seeking your inputs and your wisdom to these questions. So let's look at production systems first. And even before the pandemic, these were important, but they're even more so now. We need more production from existing farmland without further encroachment on wilderness areas. It has been promulgated that one of the sources of past, current, and future pandemics will be humans going into ecosystems and interacting with organisms that we haven't done in the past, and therefore these chances for cross-infection come up. So always been important, and even more so now. Our system's got to be more input use efficient, less energy rich inputs, particularly in terms of the disruption to supply chains we've talked about. Less greenhouse gas emissiveness. We have to produce more food, more nutritious food. It's about nutritional security as well as food security. We need a greater diversity of production to have resilient systems, and we need adaptation to climate risks. And so these are challenges that were there, but they've been exacerbated by the pandemic and in the future. And if we look globally, there's much momentum in addressing this and putting those sorts of systems in place through sustainable agricultural intensification, a scientifically sound pathway to more restorative, more regenerative agri-food systems. The principles of sustainable agricultural intensification, simultaneous enhancement of productivity and ecosystem health, both have to be occurring at the same time and the same magnitude. And sustainable intensification is about producing more, or perhaps we should start saying enough with less. And there are many good publications in 2020 recently on this topic, which I draw your attention to, and particularly those two in Nature Sustainability in April 2020. So production systems. But also got to think about other options that are already ongoing, but will they be more important? Should they be more important? Peri-urban farming, vertical farming. Certainly, these help address some of the supply chain issues we've seen. And they're also areas where new technologies and machine learning and robotics are being used in the most amazing ways. Seeing new railway stations being built in countries, and underneath them are large vertical farming operations. And we're looking at this increasing number of plant-based products for foodstuffs. And this lends itself to production in laboratories, production in glass houses and elsewhere. And then right out there, revolution, not evolution, is as a human race, do we need to start thinking about nutrition and not food? In other words, that we can produce things that will meet people's nutritional requirements in terms of vitamins and other essentials, but it may not be delivered in the food we're used to eating. It may be in some bioprocessed product that produces nutrition, but not food. Is that going to be part of the way forward that we should be looking at? Obviously not all of it. Looking at another aspect of the future, the most common factor that's come out across the world, and is really important here in Australia as well, been the disruptions to the workforce and provision of labour for the agri-food sector. And if we look at the agri-food sector, and I'll concentrate more here in Australia, but it applies just about anywhere, it's a sector that is highly dependent on temporary or itinerant workforce, on farms, in processing, in outlets, cafes, restaurants, areas occupied by backpackers, international students, migrant, immigrant labour, etc. It's a sector where minimum wages predominate. It's a sector where there's often poor or difficult working and living conditions. And it's certainly a sector where we have insufficient investment in learning and career development to actually develop a workforce necessary to make our agri-food systems fit for purpose and for sustainable and resilient food production. And it's an area where I believe urgent attention is required. Of course, in some areas, there could be a role for thinking about it differently, about the role of robotics, doing some of this labour on farms. But it's certainly an area that requires great thought and attention. And I just want to give another couple of examples of that. And they come from New Zealand, which I always believe is a country which provides some leadership in agriculture. But it's interesting that in New Zealand, still looking at basically the same issues we're looking at here in Australia. An article from the Conversation. New Zealand needs a plan to help migrant workers pick fruit and veg, or prices will soar and farms go bust. If this summer's crops quite literally go to the birds, then farms may go under, families will suffer, and consumers will see the price of seasonal produce skyrocket. The recent $30 a kilo price of courgettes, more than triple the normal price, was a warning. But the interesting thing, when we go back and look at that headline, it's actually looking to do more of the same, about helping migrant workers, etc. Not really a change of how we do business and perhaps developing a better national workforce. And this example is also from New Zealand, but from the dairy industry. And what the authors said is that it's a challenge to overcome the negative aspects of current dairy employment practice and the value and develop its workforce, migrant and domestic equally, and so provide New Zealand farm businesses with the human capacity to achieve their short and long-term goals. And so it's clear that we really need to rethink about how we are developing, training, educating our workforce for the future of more resilient agri-food systems. I'm going to conclude here, colleagues, by saying obviously there are a few definitive answers, evolving scenarios, things are changing as we've been sitting here. But we have to look at the pandemic and its impacts now and in the future in terms of its exacerbation and interaction with other factors, and the disruption to our China market are difficult enough to deal with, but even more so under the pandemic. But there have been some clear answers. Good governance, absolutely critical. Clearly, business as usual is going to be business in decline. And we clearly need to be better prepared for the next global pandemic or similar perturbation. What are the ways forward? What should we be doing? Revolution or evolution? Is the global supermarket model just diminished or is it finished? And these are the things that we're now throwing open for discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tim. That was a very interesting seminar, and I think you've already addressed a couple of the questions that have come in. I want to look at robotics a little bit more. You've mentioned that robotics may help to deal with our over-reliance on itinerant workers, particularly people from overseas on temporary visas. One of the challenges of increased robotics, though, or mechanisation, is it requires a specialised workforce of people, who are into mechatronics engineering and so on. But these are exactly the same people that urban people need to run factories and transport systems and so on. How does a regional community compete with urban settings for this highly specialised workforce that really probably doesn't even see itself working in agriculture?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Joe, and it obviously it relates to broader than that. It's about people not imagining themselves working in regional areas. So there's a couple of things I think that the pandemic has changed. The mindset. We've seen a net, for example, a net loss of population in Melbourne and Sydney as people have realised that they can live in the regions and get a job in the regions. So that's a mindset change that the pandemic's already bringing. And therefore, then the other thing is that we've shown that through connectivity, just as we're doing now with Zoom, you can actually do a whole range of things that we didn't really think about before. And so I see the scope to get that sort of expertise operating in our agri-food sectors. But one of the things is that we have to see the agri-food sector as a career destination, not just for scientists or for farmers, etc., but a career destination for these highly technical and well-educated specialist people. In my mind, global food and nutritional security is humankind's greatest challenge in the coming decades. And therefore, to put your powers of education and knowledge around robotics technology or similar technologies to actually addressing this global challenge, to me, is about the best thing you can do with it. But we need to sell that story better. And I suppose the encouraging thing is that when we're looking at the enrollments in universities, and colleges for agriculture, they're running at some of the highest levels run for a long time. So I think there is a mindset change happening.
Thank you. Snow?
Thank you. Tim, one of the questions has answered, not answered, but raised the question of, you mentioned, and it came out of the Snow study, it's not mine, of course, that resilience, what does resilience really mean? Does resilience mean the ability to accept losses and bounce back? How do we define resilience in terms of global food systems? Because that's what it comes down to in many ways.
Yes, it's a very good question. And I have to say, there are some people who, object to the use of the term resilience, because what their argument about it, quite rightly, is that resilience is, hey, we're going to buckle down and we're going to settle back in, and we're just going to try and exist, etc. And that is one definition of resilience, and that's not what we're looking for. Of course, what we want to do is to make our systems continually and continuously productive and profitable, and despite the impacts of things like pandemics, other perturbations, climate change, needs to change the use of energy-rich inputs, needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's really building much greater technological strength into these systems. That's the sort of resilience that we're talking about. And there are some fairly, fairly straightforward things there that, as we know in most aspects of life, that more diversity generally gives greater resilience in terms of whether you're investing your own money in various financial areas, or if you're in a farming system. There's now clear evidence that in the cropping and mixed farming areas, that, for example, that mixed farming, those with both livestock and crops, came through the tough drought periods we've been experiencing better than those that were just growing crops.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, there's been a set of questions which relate to the topic of fairness and equity. In particular, Australians are very used to cheap food, but we now realise a lot of that dependence has been on exploiting a workforce, predominantly migrant workforce in some cases, but also domestic workforce. How do we change the conversation about food prices and fairness, and how do we make sure that this revolution that might need to occur actually doesn't leave people behind and is fair to people broadly?
Look, I think Joe and the colleague who asked that question or made that point, it is absolutely so important and so right what has been said, that whatever we do, we have to make sure that we take everyone with us. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking at the global level, and as I said before, in areas like this, until everyone's safe, no one's safe. Because there is also, clear evidence that, regional conflicts are increasingly coming now around food security. So we've got to be doing as much as we can as a nation of helping that with our science and our technologies. But likewise, it comes down to, at the national level, when we're looking at the workforce. I mean, to me, it is a real shock. I've lived long enough to remember back to the time when the key part of many farms was an absolutely dedicated, well-trained worker or group of workers on a farm. They felt that they owned that farm themselves. They were, they will always be available, whatever happened, to help. they knew that farm like the back of their hand, and it was like having 5 farmers or 3 farmers instead of 1 on the place. And we've seen that transform to friends of mine now who are broadacre croppers, you know, who usually rely on 10 or 12 backpackers to be, you know, to be doing much of the work peak stuff. It's a false economy. It's clearly a false economy. And as I say, I think that one of the things the pandemic has done is shone a light on that and said, hey, I think we need to rethink this. And of course, it doesn't just apply to that. So coming back to your question of fairness, it's not a good look for any industry to be the subject of media articles that say that workers, you know, are not getting the conditions, not getting the pay, etc., that they warrant. And I think we just got to look at the economics and the, you know, the fairness of what we are doing in relation to that. And in a country like Australia, if that means that we're going to be paying some more for our food, then that's you know, part of the reality of it, because we certainly have to be taking our share of that, delivering that fairness.
Thank you, Tim. Perhaps another question, not quite, it's a different theme, but it has resonances with what you've just talked about. You know, the next great perturbation, global warming, will probably be an even greater challenge than COVID. So what can we learn with the way we coped with COVID, particularly in Australia, where science was given a, you know, some authority to recommend what actually happened, whereas perhaps particularly in global warming, seems economics has or basically profit, has a predominance in decisions that are made. So what can we learn from COVID that might help us in the next great perturbation?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Snow. Thank you very much. And as I said before, that, you know, there are silver linings from the pandemic, in that they've shone a spotlight on issues that have been there, but we just haven't paid enough attention to. And I think there's 2 things, as you said, in relation to the potential impacts in relation to climate change and climate change action. One is that there has been, and it's really been impressive, the listening to science. We, you know, it doesn't matter which political leader or it has been, they have said, this is based on the science, this is based on the evidence, this is based on the facts, this is based on the modeling. And I think that certainly has resonated with many people. And, you know, I mentioned good governance before, and whichever the colour of government we're talking about in the country, there's been good governance in this country around COVID, and we've been very fortunate. When we think about, so I think there'll be a spillover in relation to trusting the science, the climate. I think we're already seeing it. And the other interesting thing, Snow, is that as people mind has been focused on that everything's fine, to suddenly everything in the world's not fine, you know, driven by the pandemic, we're seeing actually much more in the papers around climate change and the need for action for climate change than we've seen for a long time. Instead of it being pushed to one side, it's actually come in now. Now we're, you know, people are talking about, if we're going to build this sustainable future, let's, you know, think about pandemics and what we're going to do there, but let's think about doing business differently. You know, you've got these announcements now of companies saying that after 2030 or, you know, something like that, we're not going to, we're only going to have electric cars. We're seeing huge developments in renewable energy. but the opportunities in agriculture are still really large. Our ability to sequester carbon in farming landscapes is just one area. Our opportunities to reduce emissions from ruminant livestock are really there. We can make a huge contribution. We have to marshal ourselves better around this. Now the opportunity is there.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, I have a very interesting question about the role of supermarkets. You were talking about the role of business in terms of climate change and its response. The question here is, what's the role of the major supermarkets in shaping food production in Australia and addressing things like price pressure? They're key players, and we've seen some not so good behaviour from them in this area over recent decades.
No, and it's a really important point. And, you know, and they're also, I mean, the supermarkets generally have been of that area of, you know, in a sense, using their huge buying power to force prices down. But the thing is, of course, that we've got to realise that if you have a price policy that makes farmers unprofitable, then you're going to exacerbate the problem. You're going to exacerbate the supply problem. I mean, we're increasingly seeing urbanisation across the world. So there's going to be more people in cities waiting for food to be delivered to them than there are out there producing them. And so if you're looking at a pricing policy, yes, it's really good to please your consumers by keeping prices down. But if you are in so doing leading to a potential disaster in terms of supply and therefore prices rocketing up, and even when, you know, we think about 2008 and a couple of other events where there have been some perturbations in world food supplies, prices have rocketed. We know the economics is there. And so supermarkets are really important. But again, diversity is something that we need there. And even one would have to say from observing, even the attitudes of the supermarkets are a bit different. You know, there's one of the major chains which says we respond to consumers' wishes. And there's another one of the major chains which actually tries to lead the thinking of consumers in relation to their preferences. And I think supermarkets have got a critical role to play in terms of helping to educate the public about that food comes from farms. It doesn't come from supermarket shelves. Fresh food, thank a farmer. And getting that connectivity back. They can be really helpful in getting that connectivity back between an increasingly urbanized population and the fact that that food actually comes from farms and rural areas.
Thank you, Tim. Looking to the future, Tim, we've had a question, is that, you know, is there a systematic attempt at present to, given that we're not anywhere over COVID yet, to analyse what the impacts have been? You know, you've stated a couple of early studies, which has been great. But then, you know, how are we going to look to, if there is to be a revolution, is there an international agency such as FAO looking into the impacts of COVID on the global food security and nutrition?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Snow, and it's something that, you know, we emphasising that we need to be looking at all levels, globally, regionally, nationally, and then locally. Globally, certainly the FAO is doing a lot of very good work, and, you know, most of the organisations, FAO, International Food Policy Research Institute, and others are looking and doing work on this. But as I said before, and I quoted some of the most recent publications that there are there, that that scientists are also doing. But it is really an evolving scenario. And some of this is, for example, those papers that were written on Australia and New Zealand were before this fresh fruit and horticultural harvesting season that we're coming into right now in the Australian summer. We know that there's going to be some major disruptions there. Some of the developing countries haven't gone yet into that next cycle, that next annual cycle, and all of the things that have happened to really threaten that. And so it is really important that we don't look at it in a piecemeal way, that we look at it in terms of this is a global issue. So as well as the world looking at issues such as climate change, as well as the world looking at issues about how to deal with the pandemic, we need an equal focus on food and nutritional security and all of those challenges.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, we've had an interesting question, I think, about disincentives, or how to get the right incentives in the system to push us in the direction we need to go in. The particular question actually relates to centralisation of supply chains and how they're disincentivizing fertiliser manufacturers from making their product more efficient. But I want to broaden the question. Over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen many examples of highly disruptive technologies coming in and changing radically the way we work. We look at social media, we look at online platforms and so on. They're almost always driven by young people who are high risk takers out there on the edge and pushing through totally different models, disregarding the current system almost completely. Will that happen in agriculture, and how do we try to generate that kind of disruption in agricultural systems to push us in directions we really need to go into that none of us can actually imagine now what they will be?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, when I'm giving lectures at the university and talking to students, I always say to them, you are the champions of tomorrow. All the things we're talking about now, the challenges, you are actually the ones that are going to help to solve them and to bring that thinking to it. And so, there are some really exciting things happening. I subscribe to one of the mailing lists that looks at startups and where investment is going in startups in the agri-food sector. And it's mind-boggling. Of what is happening in there, and I believe that many of the breakthroughs that we're looking for, they're not going to come from agricultural science. They're going to come from material science. They're going to come from ICT. They're going to come maybe from the mining industry. They're going to come from the aeronautical industry, etc. That if we're talking about the importance, a fundamental issue around farm sustainability, soil carbon and nitrogen levels, and we actually can't have a ready way of having real-time measurement of those, a simple way of doing them, and something like waving this over them and driving over the paddock and knowing what's going on would really help us to make decisions. But we do know that the mining industry can detect a deposit of a kilometre or so or more under the ground, and it can even do it from radar. So those technologies are going to come in. Are there going to be biopolymers that are going to protect crops from frost, heat, drought, even, etc. So I think that one of the things that we have to do is that we've got to excite not just the people that we're teaching agriculture to, and we've certainly got to put these ideas in their heads, but we've also got to be interacting with all the other disciplines and saying, hey, here's a really important global issue. around food security that we need you to put your mind to. And I think we're seeing more of it. But that to me is a really exciting area.
Thanks, Tim. I think, Snow, one last question and then we'll need to close.
Yeah, that's a real challenge, Tim, but I really agree with you, Tim. Rather than saying to the current generation that we teach, this is your problem, I sort of love to say this is your opportunity. There's a whole new world out there, and talking about ag tech, we know it's a very vibrant area, but it's not only inhabited by agriculturalists, everyone's in there. The final question here is that, Australia has built an agricultural future and an agricultural sustainability on an exporting nation. Does this major disruption that has occurred due to COVID in domestic versus export industries, and also we're seeing some political ramifications too, in terms of closing borders for perhaps political reasons. How do you see the future system? Will it be this global system, or will it be perhaps a more resilient system that is more reliant on domestic supply?
Thanks, Snow. It's a question that has been raised several times, and one that I've even, I've raised myself several times. I mean, we looked at at one stage, going back 50 or 60 years, the mantra was self-sufficiency, helping countries to be self-sufficient. And that clearly had some real problems with it around efficiencies, competitive advantage. And so we went to be countries to be food secure. And that brought in international trade. And international trade is going to remain really important. But that balance between having all your eggs in the basket of what I'm calling the global supermarket, and having greater resilience, greater production, and at home, I think that balance will change. And it won't just be in the agri-food sectors. We're already seeing it in terms of manufacturing, particularly around medical areas, etc. And I think that balance will change. I think we need to be more innovative about how we think about it. And we need, I suppose I'll finish on this. I believe that now that, we talk about looking through the lens of certain things, but our agri-food sectors, we now need to be looking at through the lenses of those global challenges. And now pandemics, looking through the lens of future pandemics, they will occur, is a key part of when we're thinking about what is the best way forward. The lenses, pandemics, of climate change, of all of those other things that I said that we need to do to sustainably produce sustainable global food security and nutritional security with less, working with less.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Snow. We have to draw this to a conclusion, but there were three other interesting questions I just want to highlight, but I don't need you to answer them. There was a question about the interdependence of agriculture and other issues like energy supply and security. There were questions about the need to take into account food wastage, particularly, for it to deal with food security, and also a question about, is there an international agency like FAO looking into the COVID impacts to make sure we have the data to make sensible conclusions on. But with that, I'd like to thank Tim for a very stimulating talk, and it's fascinating looking into an issue that perhaps most of us hadn't really thought about, I think, as we go through our lives over the last 12 months, thinking about the other consequences of COVID beyond the immediate health impacts. So thank you, Tim, and for that great insight, and also for referencing a number of the pieces of literature that are out there that will allow us to hunt this up. I would note for the listeners that this talk has been recorded, and it will be made available relatively soon, in the next little while, after we've had a chance to look at it, and it will be up on the ATSE website, I believe. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us in this first seminar in the series. And we look forward to joining us again in our next talk. Thank you very much. Good day.